March 15, 1943. 27,000 feet above the Belgian countryside. Hauptmann Werner Shrewer of Yaggushwad. 26 squinted through his Fakawolf 190's armored windscreen at the approaching formation of American fighters. Through his headset, he transmitted to his wingman with barely concealed amusement. "The Americans have sent us flying barrels." Below them, 16 Republic P47 Thunderbolts climbed laboriously through the thin air, their massive radial engines straining against gravity and their own enormous weight. To German eyes accustomed to the sleek lines of Messerschmitt 109s and the angular efficiency of Fakawolf 190s, these corpulent American machines appeared almost comical. Their bulbous fuselages topped with greenhouse canopies, stubby wings that seemed inadequate for their bulk, and propellers that dwarfed anything in the Luftwaffe invent, or recreated silhouettes that defied every principle of fighter aircraft design that German pilots had learned to respect. What Shrewer couldn't know, what none of the veteran German pilots preparing to bounce the climbing Americans could have imagined, was that they were witnessing the arrival of the most devastating aerial weapon system ever deployed. Hidden within those ungainly wings lay 8 Browning AE&M, 2 machine guns, each one a masterpiece of American engineering precision. These weren't the rifle-caliber weapons that had armed fighters at the war's beginning, nor the cannon with limited ammunition that German aircraft carried. These were 50-caliber monsters, each one capable of spitting armor-piercing incendiary rounds at 850 rounds per minute, with muzzle velocities exceeding 2,800 feet per second. The mathematics of destruction were already loaded in those broad Thunderbolt wings. 3,400 rounds of ammunition distributed among 8 guns created a combined rate of fire approaching 100 rounds per second. At the standard convergence distance of 300 yards, all 8 weapon streams intersected in a killing zone roughly 6 feet in diameter. Any aircraft unfortunate enough to enter that zone faced a wall of lead weighing 9 pounds per second, each projectile carrying enough kinetic energy to punch through armor plating and ignite fuel systems simultaneously. But on that March morning, as Shrewer led his formation into what he assumed would be another routine engagement with inexperienced American pilots flying inferior equipment, the revolution in aerial warfare was about to announce itself with devastating clarity. The German pilots, diving from their altitude advantage, had every reason for confidence. They flew aircraft that had dominated European skies for 3 years. Their Fakawolf 190A5s and Messerschmitt 109G6s represented the pinnacle of German aeronautical engineering, armed with 20mm cannon and 13mm machine guns that could destroy any Allied fighter with a few well-placed hits. More importantly, they possessed something the Americans lacked: experience. These were veterans of the Battle of Britain, survivors of the brutal air war over the Eastern Front, men who had accumulated hundreds of combat hours against Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Soviet fighters. The average German pilot in Yaggushwad, 26 that morning, had more combat experience than entire American squadrons combined. They understood energy management, deflection shooting, and the tactical nuances that separated living aces from dead novices. The Americans climbing toward them were rookies flying their first missions over occupied Europe. Most had fewer than 50 combat hours. Some had never fired their guns at an enemy aircraft. They flew in the rigid formations their training manuals prescribed, telegraphed their inexperience to any German pilot with eyes to see. Their aircraft, while impressively large, moved with the ponderous grace of freight trains rather than the nimble agility that aerial combat demanded. Yet something unprecedented was about to occur in the skies over Belgium. As the German fighters rolled into their attack dives, confident in their tactical superiority and technological advantage, they were about to encounter an American innovation that would fundamentally alter the nature of aerial warfare. The P-47 Thunderbolt represented more than just another fighter aircraft. It embodied a completely different philosophy of air combat, one that prioritized overwhelming firepower over traditional maneuverability, one that bet everything on the concentrated destruction that 8 synchronized machine guns could deliver. The Thunderbolt's armament system was the product of exhaustive American engineering and testing. Each Browning AN/M2 machine gun had been refined through thousands of hours of ground testing and aerial trials. The ammunition feeding systems had been perfected to prevent jams during high-G maneuvers. The gun harmonization had been calculated with mathematical precision to create maximum destruction at optimal engagement ranges. Even the gun placement within the wings had been designed to minimize structural interference while maximizing ballistic concentration. What made the P-47's armament truly revolutionary wasn't just the number of guns, but their quality and reliability. Unlike German cannon that carried limited ammunition, typically 120 to 200 rounds per weapon, each American machine gun fed from a 425-round ammunition box. This meant American pilots could maintain sustained fire for over 30 seconds, an eternity in aerial combat where most engagements lasted mere minutes. While German pilots had to make every shot count due to ammunition limitations, P-47 pilots could afford to spray devastating bursts that virtually guaranteed hits on maneuvering targets. The ammunition itself represented cutting-edge military technology. The standard combat load mixed armor-piercing incendiary tracer, and ball ammunition in patterns designed to both penetrate and ignite. The armor-piercing rounds could defeat nearly an inch of face-hardened steel at 200 yards, more than sufficient to penetrate any aircraft armor then in service. The incendiary composition burned at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to ignite aluminum airframe structures and fuel systems with devastating effect. But perhaps most importantly, the P-47's guns had been engineered for absolute reliability. American manufacturers had learned harsh lessons from early war aircraft that suffered gun jams at critical moments. The Thunderbolt's weapon systems included electric heating elements to prevent freezing at altitude, sophisticated ammunition feeding mechanisms that functioned regardless of aircraft attitude, and individual gun charging systems that allowed pilots to clear jams without landing. These weren't temperamental weapons that required constant maintenance. They were industrial-grade killing machines designed to function flawlessly under the most extreme combat conditions. As Major Donald Blakesley, commanding the 4th Fighter Group, would later observe, the P-47's armament represented American industrial democracy applied to warfare. Where German aircraft carried a few expensive, precisely manufactured cannon shells, American fighters carried thousands of mass-produced rounds that achieved through volume what German weapons achieved through individual precision. It was the difference between a craftsman's tool and a factory's output, between European artisanship and American mass production. The psychological impact of facing 850 caliber machine guns would prove as devastating as their physical effects. German pilots accustomed to brief cannon bursts would soon encounter sustained streams of heavy machine gun fire that seemed to last forever. The sound alone, 8 weapons firing in perfect synchronization, created an audio signature unlike anything in aerial warfare. Veterans would later describe it as the sound of industrial destruction, mechanical death delivered with American efficiency and unlimited ammunition. But on that March morning over Belgium, as Hauptmann Shrewer led his experienced pilots into what they assumed would be another victory against inexperienced Americans flying inferior aircraft, none of these realizations had yet crystallized. The revolution was about to begin with the first trigger pull, the first convergent burst, the first devastating demonstration of what concentrated American firepower could accomplish against aircraft designed for an earlier era of aerial warfare. The engagement began at 13:47 hours when Unteroffizier Klaus Weber, flying tail-end Charlie in the German formation, spotted the first P-47 breaking from the American climb and turning aggressively toward the diving Fakawolfs. Weber's combat report, recovered from Luftwaffe archives decades later, captured the moment when German confidence first wavered. The fat American fighter turned inside Feldwebel Hartmann's attack. Impossible at that speed and altitude. Then I saw the gun flashes. What Weber witnessed violated every principle of energy management that German tactical despite its massive weight and ungainly appearance, a doctrine held sacred. The P-47D somehow reversed a high-speed diving attack and brought its guns to bear. The Thunderbolt's pilot, 2nd Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron, had executed a maneuver that physics said should have been impossible for an aircraft weighing nearly 7 tons at combat load. But Johnson possessed advantages that German pilots couldn't see and wouldn't understand until far too late. His P-47's turbo-supercharged Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double wasp engine maintained full power output at altitudes where German fighters gasped for air. While Shrewer's Focke-Wulf 190 lost 30% of its power above 20,000 feet, Johnson's Thunderbolt actually improved its performance as altitude increased. At 27,000 feet, the P-47 held decisive advantages in power-to-weight ratio, climb rate, and sustained turn capability. The first burst lasted exactly 2.3 seconds. Johnson's gun camera recorded 8 streams of tracers converging on Weber's wingman, Gefreiter Hans Müller, who had committed to a head-on pass assuming American inexperience would result in an early breakoff. Müller's tactical calculation proved fatally flawed. Instead of breaking away as German doctrine predicted, Johnson held his course until the last possible second, then triggered all 8 machine guns simultaneously. 200 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition struck Müller's Fakawolf 190 in those 2.3 seconds. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds punched through the German fighter's engine cowling, severed control cables, ruptured fuel lines, and ignited the main fuel tank. Müller's aircraft didn't simply fall from the sky. It disintegrated in mid-air, transformed from a functional fighter into burning debris in less time than it takes to draw a breath. Hauptmann Shrewer, leading the German formation, witnessed destruction unlike anything in his 3 years of combat experience. His radio transmission, intercepted by Allied listening posts, revealed shock that bordered on disbelief. Hartmann is gone. The American guns? Mein Gott, what are those guns? The psychological impact rippled through the German formation instantly. These weren't the brief cannon bursts they had learned to respect and evade. This was sustained, overwhelming firepower that seemed to transform aircraft into scrap metal through sheer volume of fire. Obergefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann, flying Shrewer's wing, attempted to avenge Müller by diving on Johnson's Thunderbolt from above and behind. Hoffmann's Messerschmitt 109 G6 carried the standard armament of 2 13mm machine guns and 1 20mm cannon, weapons that had proved devastatingly effective against British Spitfires and Soviet fighters. His attack should have succeeded. The approach was textbook perfect, executed from the classic advantage position with superior diving speed. Johnson's response demonstrated why American pilots were learning to love the P-47's unconventional characteristics. Instead of attempting to outturn the lighter, more maneuverable Messerschmitt, Johnson pushed his Thunderbolt into a vertical dive. The massive American fighter accelerated past 500 miles per hour, faster than Hoffmann's Messerschmitt could achieve even in a vertical descent. Within seconds, the Hunter had become the hunted as Johnson pulled out of his dive and climbed back toward the German formation with energy to spare. The reversal stunned the remaining German pilots. Feldwebel Ernst Kessler, a veteran of over 200 combat missions, later testified to American intelligence officers about the psychological impact of that moment. We knew our aircraft. We knew their limitations and capabilities. The American fighter should not have been able to climb back to our altitude after such a dive. Yet there it was, guns pointing at us, ready to fire again. What Kessler couldn't know was that Johnson's Thunderbolt carried sufficient ammunition for sustained combat that would have been impossible in German aircraft. While Kessler's own Fakawolf 190 carried 240 rounds for its 20mm cannon, enough for perhaps 12 seconds of firing time, Johnson's 8 machine guns held 3,400 rounds total. The American pilot could maintain combat effectiveness for minutes rather than seconds, spraying bursts that German pilots had to avoid while conserving their own severely limited ammunition. The tactical implications became clear as the engagement continued. German pilots found themselves forced into defensive maneuvering by an opponent they had initially dismissed as inferior. Shrewer's formation, which had begun the attack with overwhelming numerical and positional advantages, discovered that American firepower density negated traditional tactical superiority. A single P-47 could engage multiple German fighters simultaneously because its weapons could destroy any target they hit, while German pilots had to position themselves perfectly for brief cannon shots. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabreski, leading another P-47 flight that arrived as reinforcements, witnessed the transformation of American tactical doctrine in real time. His post-mission report noted that German fighters, previously aggressive in their attacks, had become notably cautious when facing concentrated 50 caliber fire. The enemy pilots who had pressed attacks to point-blank range against Spitfires now broke off their passes at 400 yards when facing our guns. They understood what our weapons could do. The mathematics of the engagement revealed American advantages that went beyond simple firepower. German cannon shells, while individually more destructive than machine gun rounds, required precise aim and offered limited opportunities for correction. A German pilot typically had one chance to position his aircraft perfectly and deliver a killing burst before his ammunition ran low. American pilots could afford to miss with their first burst, adjust their aim, and fire again with devastating effect. By 13:55 hours, 8 minutes after the engagement began, 3 German fighters lay scattered across the Belgian countryside, while the P-47 formation continued its mission with minimal damage. Shrewer's remaining pilots had learned a lesson that would spread through Luftwaffe squadrons across Western Europe within days. The fat American fighters weren't the easy targets German intelligence had predicted. They were flying weapons platforms that could deliver destruction on a scale that German tactical doctrine hadn't anticipated. The engagement over Belgium represented more than just another air battle. It marked the beginning of a psychological transformation that would ultimately prove more devastating to German morale than the physical losses themselves. Word of the P-47's capabilities spread through Luftwaffe pilot circles with the speed of genuine fear, carrying implications that would fundamentally alter German air combat tactics for the remainder of the war. The reverberations of that March engagement reached Luftwaffe headquarters within hours, but the full implications wouldn't be understood until German pilots began encountering P-47s across multiple theaters. Oberst Adolf Galland, general of the fighter arm, initially dismissed early reports as combat exaggeration. His staff officers, analyzing pilot debriefs from Western Front squadrons, struggled to reconcile accounts of American firepower with their understanding of conventional fighter armament. The numbers seemed impossible. 8 machine guns firing simultaneously, sustained bursts lasting 30 seconds, individual aircraft destroying multiple targets in single passes. What German intelligence failed to grasp was that American industrial philosophy had produced something entirely unprecedented in fighter aircraft design. The P-47 wasn't simply a larger version of existing fighters carrying more guns. It represented a fundamental reimagining of aerial warfare priorities, where overwhelming firepower took precedence over traditional performance metrics like climb rate and turning radius. Republic Aviation had built a flying gun platform that happened to be capable of flight, rather than a maneuverable aircraft that happened to carry weapons. The technical specifications told a story that German engineers found difficult to accept. Each Browning AN/M2 machine gun weighed 61 pounds and measured 57 inches in length. Installing 8 of these weapons, along with their ammunition feeds, electrical systems, and structural reinforcements, added over 2,000 pounds to the P-47's empty weight. German designers, obsessed with minimizing weight to maximize performance, considered such mass penalties unacceptable. How could American pilots achieve air superiority while carrying an extra ton of armament? The answer lay in American engine technology that German manufacturers couldn't replicate. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower, represented the pinnacle of American aviation power plant development. Its 2-stage supercharger, fed by exhaust-driven turbochargers, maintained full power output at altitudes where German engines lost effectiveness. While Fakawolf 19s and Messerschmitt 19s suffered significant power degradation above 20,000 feet, the P-47's engine actually improved its performance characteristics as altitude increased. German test pilots who later flew captured P-47's reported sensations unlike anything in Luftwaffe service. The massive engine produced not just power, but torque characteristics that German radials couldn't match. American pilots described their aircraft as having unlimited reserves, capable of sustained high-power operations that would have destroyed German engines within minutes. The reliability margins built into American power plants allowed combat maneuvers that German pilots considered suicidal, knowing their own engines couldn't withstand such treatment. But engine power alone didn't explain the P-47's devastating combat effectiveness. American ammunition production had achieved standardization and quality control that German factories couldn't approach. Each 50 caliber round was manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, ensuring reliable feeding through the complex mechanisms that synchronized 8 weapons. German pilots, accustomed to frequent gun jams and ammunition failures, discovered that American weapon systems functioned flawlessly under conditions that would have rendered German armament inoperative. The psychological warfare aspect of the P-47's presence became as significant as its physical capabilities. German pilots reported that the distinctive sound of 850 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously created an audio signature that could be heard from miles away. The mechanical rhythm of synchronized weapons, each cycling at slightly different rates, produced a thunderous cacophony that announced American presence long before visual contact. Ground troops learned to recognize the approach of P-47 formations by sound alone, diving for cover at the first indication of their distinctive engine note. Major Heinz Baer, one of Germany's highest-scoring aces with over 200 victories, encountered P-47s during a bomber interception mission in May 1943. His detailed combat report, preserved in Luftwaffe archives, captured the growing German awareness of American firepower superiority. Baer described watching a single P-47 engage 3 Messerschmitt 109s simultaneously, using its superior ammunition capacity to maintain sustained fire while German pilots were forced to break off attacks to conserve their limited cannon rounds. The tactical implications became increasingly clear as spring turned to summer. German fighters designed for brief, decisive engagements using superior maneuverability and precise gunnery found themselves outmatched by American aircraft that could afford to miss with their first attempts and continue firing until they achieved hits. P-47 pilots developed techniques that maximized their firepower advantages, approaching German formations at high speed and firing continuous bursts that forced enemy pilots into defensive maneuvering rather than offensive attacks. American training programs had prepared pilots for exactly this type of warfare. Unlike German instruction that emphasized individual marksmanship and precise ammunition conservation, American gunnery schools taught sustained fire techniques designed to overwhelm targets through sheer volume. P-47 pilots learned to fire in bursts lasting 3 to 5 seconds, adjusting their aim through observed tracer impact rather than attempting perfect initial positioning. The abundance of ammunition made such techniques possible, while German pilots with limited cannon rounds couldn't afford similar approaches. The standardization of American ammunition loads provided additional advantages that German intelligence consistently underestimated. Every P-47 carried identical armament configurations, allowing pilots to understand exactly what firepower support they could expect from wingmen and squadron mates. German formations, equipped with varying mixes of machine guns and cannon, depending on aircraft type and availability, couldn't achieve the same coordination. American flight leaders could coordinate attacks, knowing that each aircraft in their formation carried identical destructive capability. Quality control in American ammunition production had reached levels that German manufacturers found impossible to achieve under wartime conditions. Each 50 caliber round underwent multiple inspections before reaching aircraft ammunition boxes. Ballistic consistency meant that American pilots could rely on predictable trajectories and impact points, while German pilots dealt with ammunition that varied significantly in performance characteristics. The difference between German craftsmanship approaches and American mass production techniques became apparent in combat reliability statistics. German pilots began reporting phenomena that challenged their understanding of aerial combat dynamics. P-47s that should have been damaged by successful cannon strikes continued flying and fighting effectively. The massive radial engines, lacking vulnerable liquid cooling systems, absorbed punishment that would have immediately disabled German inline engines. American pilots brought home aircraft with cylinder heads shot away, control cables severed, and fuel systems punctured, yet still managed controlled landings at friendly airfields. The durability revelations forced German tactical doctrine to evolve rapidly. Pilots who had previously considered single cannon hits sufficient to down enemy fighters discovered that P-47s required sustained attack to achieve kills. The robust construction of American aircraft, combined with pilot armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, created targets that absorbed damage far exceeding German expectations. Meanwhile, German fighters subjected to P-47 firepower disintegrated under concentrated 50 caliber strikes that no amount of armor could deflect. By June 1943, Luftwaffe pilot casualties in the Western Theater had increased dramatically wherever P-47s operated. The correlation wasn't immediately obvious to German commanders, who attributed losses to increasing Allied numerical superiority rather than superior American firepower. But experienced pilots understood the difference. They had faced numerical disadvantages before and survived through superior tactics and aircraft performance. The P-47 represented something fundamentally different, an opponent that negated traditional advantages through overwhelming destructive capability. Training programs at German flight schools struggled to prepare new pilots for combat against American heavy fighters. Instructors who had developed successful techniques against Spitfires and Soviet aircraft found their methods inadequate when applied to P-47 encounters. The sustained firepower and altitude performance of American aircraft required tactical approaches that German doctrine hadn't anticipated. Young pilots arriving at operational squadrons discovered that their training had prepared them for a different war entirely. The ammunition logistics alone revealed American industrial superiority that German planners found incomprehensible. Each P-47 sortie consumed 3,400 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, weighing nearly half a ton. American supply systems delivered fresh ammunition to forward airfields daily, ensuring that every mission launched with full combat loads. German squadrons, struggling with ammunition shortages that forced rationing of cannon rounds, watched American formations take off carrying more firepower than entire Luftwaffe groups possessed in reserve. Intelligence reports filtering back to Berlin painted an increasingly grim picture of American capabilities. The P-47 wasn't just another fighter aircraft entering service. It represented industrial warfare applied to aerial combat, where quantity and quality merged to create overwhelming superiority. German engineers studying captured American equipment discovered manufacturing techniques and material sciences that exceeded their own capabilities by significant margins. The technological gap was widening rather than narrowing as the war progressed. The transformation of German pilot attitudes toward American fighters became evident in radio intercepts and prisoner interrogations. Where previous months had featured confident communications about engaging inferior American aircraft, Luftwaffe transmissions increasingly contained warnings about P-47 formations and recommendations for avoidance rather than engagement. The psychological shift from predator to prey was occurring across German fighter squadrons as word of American firepower superiority spread through pilot networks. Colonel Johannes Steinhoff, commanding Yaggushwad 77, received reports from his squadron leaders throughout the summer that defied rational analysis. Experienced pilots were returning from missions with accounts that sounded more like fantasy than combat reports. American fighters that absorbed direct cannon strikes and continued attacking, sustained machine gun bursts that lasted longer than German pilots had ammunition to respond. Individual P-47s engaging entire German formations and emerging victorious through sheer firepower dominance. Steinhoff's own encounter with P-47s over the Rhine Valley in July 1943 shattered his confidence in German tactical superiority. Leading a mixed formation of Messerschmitt 109s and Fakawolf 190s against what intelligence reported as a small American fighter sweep, Steinhoff discovered 12 P-47s operating at 28,000 feet, with coordination that seemed impossible for such heavy aircraft. His attack, perfectly executed according to established doctrine, resulted in the loss of 4 German fighters without achieving a single American kill. The after-action analysis revealed tactical realities that German doctrine hadn't anticipated. American pilots had refused to engage in traditional turning fights, instead using their superior high-altitude performance to maintain energy advantages while delivering devastating gun passes. Each P-47 attack lasted only seconds, but those brief engagements resulted in catastrophic damage to German aircraft. Steinhoff's own Messerschmitt returned with over 60 machine gun strikes, any one of which could have proved fatal in a less robust aircraft. Major Egon Meyer, one of Germany's most successful bomber-destroyers with 42 confirmed victories, adapted his techniques specifically for P-47 encounters after losing half his squadron to American heavy fighters during August operations. His tactical modifications revealed the extent to which American firepower had forced German doctrine to evolve. Instead of the aggressive frontal attacks that had proved devastatingly effective against flying fortresses, Meyer's pilots now approached P-47 formations with extreme caution, seeking fleeting opportunities for brief attacks before disengaging rapidly. The ammunition expenditure patterns told their own story of American abundance versus German scarcity. Intelligence analysis of crashed P-47s revealed that American pilots routinely expended thousands of rounds per mission, firing sustained bursts that German pilots couldn't afford with their limited cannon ammunition. A typical German fighter carried perhaps 300 rounds of cannon ammunition, sufficient for 15 seconds of firing time if used continuously. American pilots possessed enough ammunition to maintain intermittent fire for entire missions, creating psychological pressure that wore down German resistance through sheer persistence. Hauptmann Kurt Bulligan, an ace with over 100 victories accumulated across multiple fronts, encountered his first P-47 formation during a bomber interception mission near Hanover in September 1943. His detailed combat memoir, published decades after the war, described the engagement as a revelation of American industrial warfare applied to aerial combat. Bulligan's squadron of 8 Fakawolf 190s, all piloted by experienced veterans, found themselves outgunned and outmaneuvered by 6 P-47s that seemed to possess unlimited ammunition and energy reserves. The engagement began conventionally enough, with German fighters using superior climbing performance to achieve altitude advantage over the climbing Americans. Bulligan's attack plan followed established doctrine: high-speed diving passes designed to achieve quick kills before American escorts could respond effectively. The execution revealed how completely American fired of the brief, decisive encounters power had altered combat dynamics. In a steer that German tactics anticipated, the battle evolved into a sustained engagement where American ammunition reserves provided decisive advantages. Bulligan's first pass, perfectly executed from the classic 6 o'clock high position, should have resulted in a quick kill against the trailing P-47. His 20mm cannon strikes were observed hits along the American fighter's fuselage and wing roots, damage that would have destroyed any German aircraft instantly. The P-47 absorbed the punishment, rolled inverted, and began a diving attack that caught Bulligan completely off guard. The American pilot's response violated every principle of defensive tactics that German experience had established. What followed challenged Bulligan's understanding of aircraft performance limitations. The damaged P-47, trailing smoke and obviously compromised, somehow maintained combat effectiveness while pursuing German fighters at speeds exceeding anything Bulligan had experienced. His Fakawolf 190, considered among the fastest fighters in German service, couldn't escape the diving American aircraft. When the P-47's 8 machine guns opened fire, the sound alone created psychological impact that Bulligan would remember for the rest of his life. The convergent streams of 50 caliber tracers created what Bulligan described as a wall of destruction that seemed to fill the entire sky. His evasive maneuvers, perfected through hundreds of previous engagements, proved inadequate against the volume of fire that American weapons could sustain. Where German pilots had learned to evade brief cannon bursts through precise timing and violent maneuvering, the sustained machine gun fire from P-47s required completely different defensive techniques that German training hadn't developed. Obergefreiter Franz Stiegler, flying wing position in Bulligan's formation, witnessed destruction that defied his 3 years of combat experience. The P-47's sustained burst, lasting over 5 seconds, literally disintegrated Unteroffizier Weber's Fakawolf 190 in midair. The aircraft didn't simply catch fire or lose control. It came apart structurally under the impact of hundreds of 50 caliber rounds, transforming from a functional fighter into scattered debris faster than human perception could follow. Weber's parachute never appeared. The psychological impact of witnessing such devastating firepower rippled through German squadrons faster than official combat reports. Pilots who had faced British Spitfires and Soviet Yaks without flinching began experiencing what medical officers termed combat stress reactions when P-47 formations appeared on the horizon. The distinctive silhouette of American heavy fighters triggered physiological responses that German flight surgeons struggled to understand and treat. Luftwaffe training commands attempted to develop countermeasures for American firepower superiority through tactical innovation and improved gunnery instruction. The efforts revealed the fundamental mismatch between German capabilities and American resources. Training programs that emphasized ammunition conservation conflicted with the reality that effective engagement of P-47s required sustained fire that German weapons couldn't provide. Instructors found themselves teaching techniques that their own aircraft couldn't execute effectively. Major Walter Noatne recently transferred from the Eastern Front, where he had accumulated over 200 victories against Soviet aircraft, discovered that his combat experience provided limited advantages against American heavy fighters. His first P-47 encounter over northern Germany in October 1943 resulted in tactical lessons that forced complete revision of his established techniques. The Americans fought differently than any opponent he had previously faced, using firepower density rather than maneuverability as their primary tactical advantage. Noatne's squadron, equipped with the latest Messerschmitt 109 G6 variants and comprised entirely of veteran pilots, should have possessed overwhelming advantages over the American formation they intercepted. The numerical superiority was decisive. 16 German fighters against 8 P-47s. The altitude advantage favored German tactics, with Noatne's aircraft positioned 3,000 feet above the Americans. The experience differential was enormous, with German pilots averaging over 150 combat hours compared to American pilots flying their first operational missions over Europe. The engagement's outcome shattered every assumption that had guided German tactical development. Within minutes of initial contact, 4 Messerschmitt 109s had been destroyed by concentrated American firepower, while the P-47 formation continued its mission with minimal damage. Noatne's own aircraft returned to base with engine damage that required complete power plant replacement, the result of a 3-second burst from a P-47 that he had assumed was already disabled by cannon fire. The laughter that had echoed through Luftwaffe ready rooms in March 1943 died somewhere over the battlefields of Western Europe, replaced by the grim understanding that American industrial might had produced something unprecedented in aerial warfare. The P-47 Thunderbolts 850 caliber machine guns didn't just outgun German fighters. They redefined what firepower meant in air combat, transforming individual aircraft into flying artillery platforms that could engage multiple opponents simultaneously and emerge victorious through sheer destructive capability. By war's end, German pilots who survived encounters with the ungainly American fighters spoke of them with respectful fear, acknowledging that the flying barrels they had once mocked possessed the concentrated fury to tear apart anything that flew. The P-47's guns hadn't just won air battles, they had won the psychological war, proving that, in industrial conflict, overwhelming firepower delivered by reliable weapons could defeat traditional advantages in speed, maneuverability, and pilot skill. The thunder of 8 synchronized machine guns had spoken with authority that even the most experienced German aces couldn't ignore, carrying a message that would echo through aviation history. Sometimes the most devastating weapon is the one your enemy never sees coming.